In January 1933, when Adolf Hitler assumed the role of Chancellor, Germany remained constrained by the Treaty of Versailles, which significantly limited its military capabilities. Following the defeat in 1918, the German army, known as the Reichswehr under the treaty, was restricted to a mere 100,000 soldiers. The nation was prohibited from possessing tanks, heavy artillery, combat aircraft, and its navy was reduced to a collection of small vessels. Furthermore, the treaty forbade the existence of a formal general staff, forcing military planning to be conducted discreetly through organizations with innocuous names. Arms production was also subjected to strict international monitoring. However, even before Hitler's ascent to power, there was a strong desire among military leaders and nationalist factions to overcome these limitations and rebuild Germany's war-making potential. The shift that occurred with the rise of the National Socialist regime was in the speed, scale, and unwavering political resolve to translate these ambitions into tangible actions. In the early months of his rule, Hitler presented his rise as the dawn of a new era for Germany. Propaganda efforts emphasized that the German people had regained strong leadership and that the nation needed to break free from the humiliation imposed by the victors of World War I. While Germany outwardly maintained compliance with the Treaty of Versailles, it secretly initiated measures to promote rearmament, conducted under the guise of administrative procedures and public works initiatives. These initial steps were designed to avoid direct confrontation with Western powers while laying the groundwork for a larger military expansion. Secret rearmament was not entirely new, as clandestine connections with the Soviet Union had been maintained since the Weimar Republic. However, under Hitler's leadership, these practices expanded and were integrated into a cohesive plan that linked economic recovery with preparations for war. Job creation in arms factories and public works was portrayed as social policy, but it served to develop an industrial base ready to support military production. A pivotal moment arrived in 1935 when Hitler openly announced the introduction of compulsory military service, transforming the Reichswehr into the Wehrmacht. The army was reorganized into larger divisions, and the development of armored and motorized units began. In the same year, the Luftwaffe, which had been secretly developing, was officially established, with significant resources allocated to create a modern air force. The Kriegsmarine, while facing budgetary and strategic limitations, also commenced a program of expansion, focusing on submarines and planning for a stronger surface fleet. The Heer, or the Land Army, experienced the most rapid expansion, growing from the 100,000 men permitted by the Treaty of Versailles to a force of several million in just a few years. Infantry, Panzer, and motorized divisions were formed, giving the army greater flexibility and mobility compared to the previous war. Officer training schools were reopened, and new doctrines were developed that aimed to avoid the static trench warfare that characterized the 1914 to 1918 conflict. Instead, the concept of a swift, decisive war was promoted, where armored vehicles and aircraft would play key roles. Under the leadership of Hermann Göring, the Luftwaffe became a prominent symbol of Germany's re-emerging military strength. From its inception, it concentrated on producing fighters like the Messerschmitt Bf 109, dive bombers such as the Junkers Ju-87 Stuka, and medium bombers like the Heinkel He-111. These aircraft were designed not only to match the capabilities of other nations, but also to create a style of warfare where aviation directly supported ground forces. The Luftwaffe was conceived not as an independent strategic force, but as an integral component of a Blitzkrieg strategy. The development of this military machine was accompanied by a doctrinal shift that sought to avoid the errors of the previous war. The stalemate of trench warfare led German officers to believe that the next war needed to be swift and involve the coordinated use of all available forces. This gave rise to the concept of Blitzkrieg, or lightning war, which wasn't a rigid, codified plan, but a set of principles emphasizing surprise, speed, and inter-service coordination. The army was to penetrate enemy lines with tanks and motorized troops, while the Air Force would destroy key targets and disrupt the enemy's rear. Politically, Hitler coupled these military preparations with public pronouncements that spoke of peace and a fair revision of the international order, while simultaneously directing all state resources towards rearmament. By 1939, the Wehrmacht had grown into a force of several million men. What had begun as rearmament disguised as social programs had transformed into a war machine ready for deployment. The Reich's pretext for invading Poland and starting World War II was based on a significant lie. From the spring of 1939, the German High Command was no longer debating whether to attack Poland, but rather when to do so. Planning began in earnest in April when Hitler issued directives for swift and decisive action. The objective was not merely military, but also to impose a definitive solution to the Polish problem, which for the Nazi regime was both territorial and ideological. The guidelines were clear. Eliminate Poland's defensive capabilities from the outset, destroy its administrative structures, and make it clear that this was not a temporary campaign. By mid-year, plans were finalized for what would become the fastest military campaign Europe had witnessed. Forces were concentrated at strategic border points, giving the Wehrmacht an overwhelming advantage. Approximately 1.5 million soldiers, nearly 2,500 tanks, and over 2,000 aircraft were prepared to participate in the offensive. The regime prepared not only the military aspects of the invasion. Weeks before the attack, a propaganda campaign was launched to justify the action. One of the most infamous fabrications was the Gleiwitz incident, a covert operation carried out by German forces disguised as Poles who simulated an attack on a German radio station. This event was presented to the world as a Polish provocation. At 4:45 a.m. on September 1, 1939, the attack commenced. The Luftwaffe bombed strategic locations within Poland, including airfields, communication centers, and military depots. Simultaneously, ground units crossed the border on multiple fronts. Panzer divisions advanced rapidly, flanked by motorized infantry securing captured areas. The attack was devastating. Within days, Polish defenses began to collapse. German forces bypassed points of resistance, surrounding them and continuing inland. Polish units, although offering resistance in various locations, were unable to coordinate effectively. Furthermore, German air superiority hampered any attempt at reorganization or counterattack. Meanwhile, propaganda within Germany promoted the idea of a preemptive, necessary, and just operation. Hitler's speeches consistently repeated this narrative, asserting that all diplomatic avenues had been exhausted. Newsreels featured carefully selected images of smiling soldiers and columns advancing unopposed. This rapid pace surprised not only the Poles, but also international observers. Within a few days, German forces were deep inside enemy territory, surrounding Warsaw and other key cities. On September 3rd, France and the United Kingdom declared war on Germany. Despite this, no immediate military action was taken by these powers. For weeks, the phony war raged in the West, characterized by minimal defensive movements. This allowed Germany to continue its offensive without the threat of a second front. By the end of September, the map of Europe had been redrawn. Poland was divided between Germany and the Soviet Union, and the world had formally entered World War II. For the Nazi regime, the campaign demonstrated military effectiveness, strategic planning, and political control. It confirmed the viability of the Blitzkrieg model. While Blitzkrieg was not yet a household word, its principles had been put into practice with brutal efficiency. The invasion of Poland not only marked the beginning of World War II, but also the starting point for a way of war where speed, surprise, and propaganda were as crucial as weaponry. In 1940, German military strategy heavily relied on speed and coordination as the primary instruments for achieving victory. Following the successful campaign in Poland, the German army shifted its focus westward. This offensive departed from traditional methods of attrition warfare. The Blitzkrieg concept was now applied on a much larger scale. The core idea was deceptively simple: rapid, deep, and coordinated penetrations by air and ground forces to disorganize the enemy before they had a chance to react. In May of that year, the Wehrmacht launched its assault on the Netherlands, Belgium, and Luxembourg. The Maginot Line, which France had constructed to prevent an invasion from the east, was rendered useless as German forces bypassed it by advancing through the Ardennes, a densely forested region considered unsuitable for large-scale military movements. This tactical decision proved crucial. Panzer divisions were able to rapidly create openings in the Allied lines, driving northward and cutting them off from their lines of supply. The rapid pace of the advance gave Allied commanders no time to regroup, leading to a collapse in morale and the command structure. France was divided, and its forces were overwhelmed. In June, France requested an armistice. The victory was complete from a military standpoint, achieved with a swiftness that shattered memories of the First World War. The success of the Blitzkrieg was not only operational, but also a propaganda triumph. Images of parades in Paris were widely broadcast. Hitler was portrayed as a brilliant leader, while the generals were presented as national heroes. Morale soared to unprecedented levels. The idea took root that the Reich could prevail in Europe through a combination of strength, speed, and unwavering determination. Following Germany's rapid victories in Western Europe, Hitler directed the army to formulate a plan for invading the United Kingdom, codenamed Sea Lion. However, the German command recognized that landing troops on British soil was impossible without first neutralizing the Royal Air Force. The Luftwaffe launched massive bombing raids, targeting airfields and later major cities like London. The aim was to instill fear and break the morale of the population. However, this tactic failed. British resistance did not weaken. For the first time, the German war machine encountered an obstacle it could not overcome. The air offensive was a strategic setback. The failure to defeat the RAF prevented the Third Reich from consolidating its complete dominance over Western Europe. The war would not be as swift or as one-sided as had been imagined. Following the rapid and decisive victory in Western Europe, the German command's subsequent strategic objective was already clearly defined. For months, Hitler had expressed in private his intention to launch a new campaign to the east. In his calculations, confrontation with the Soviet Union was a necessary step to secure Lebensraum, or living space. Planning for this operation began systematically after the summer of 1940. In December of that year, Hitler signed Directive Number 21, known as Operation Barbarossa. The instructions were clear. It was to be a swift campaign, dismantling the Red Army before it could retreat. The envisioned outcome was a short, decisive, and devastating war. The logistical deployment was immense. 3 large army groups were to advance along a front spanning almost 3,000 kilometers. More than 3 million German soldiers were mobilized, along with hundreds of thousands of horses, thousands of tanks, cannons, and vehicles of all types. Preparations were carried out under a cloak of partial secrecy. While the sheer volume of troop movements was difficult to hide, the true scale of the invasion remained concealed until the very last moment.